It's my real pleasure and distinct honor to be able to welcome to our program tonight Ambassador Susan Page, who, when I asked who should I get to speak on this topic, the answer was there's only one person, and it's Susan Page. So I'm thrilled.
They were thinking about the other Susan Page.
I'm really thrilled that she agreed to come and to share her experience and her wisdom with us. She has a long and very distinguished biography and set of accomplishments, but I'll just highlight a few of them so you know a little bit about her. She is a professor of practice of international diplomacy at the University of Michigan's Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy and a professor of practice at the University of Michigan Law School. So that's 2 appointments, guys. That's pretty darn good. She's on all kinds of committees at the university: the Provost's Faculty Advisory Committee, the Council on Global Engagement, the Africa Studies Center Executive Committee, and I could go on and on and on. She is an elected member of the American Academy of Diplomacy and serves on the Board of Trustees of the Carter Center. She's also a founding advisory board member of the Foreign Policy for America and the Advisory Council of the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area. She has tons of deep expertise in law, in international relations, particularly in Africa. She has excellent French language skills, and if you get a chance, ask her about what she did in Sudan. That's a whole other story. She has expertise in foreign policy, political, legal, analytical. She's a Harvard-trained attorney. She was sworn in as the first U.S. ambassador to the Republic of South Sudan in 2011, a few months after the creation of the world's newest nation. Following her historic tenure in South Sudan, she served as acting U.S. permanent representative to the African Union and to the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and chargé d'affaires to the U.S. mission to the African Union in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. She's had all kinds of other distinguished positions, literally one after the other. She began her foreign affairs career at the U.S. Department of State in 1991 as an attorney advisor. Following her conclusion, and for those of you who are Rotarians, she did a Rotary International postgraduate fellowship to Nepal, where she conducted research on women's and children's rights. She also serves on the Rhodes Scholar Board of Directors, the advisory board of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. She's originally from the Chicago area. She received a bachelor's in English with distinction from the University of Michigan, certificates of distinction and merit from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and her Juris Doctorate from the Harvard Law School. She's a published author of numerous articles. She's a sought-after lecturer and meat analyst on various media channels. And she's also, as of August, the interim director of the Wagner Diplomacy Center at the University of Michigan. During her State Department career, she served in Sudan, Kenya, Rwanda, and Botswana, among other positions. Susan describes herself as a lover of books, culture, and travel. And I'm so pleased that she could come tonight, and so looking forward to her presentation. Please hold your questions till the end, and then she'll be happy to answer anything you may have. Ambassador Page, welcome.
So I'll tell a funny story. When I was in South Sudan as ambassador, you have this armored vehicle and you have to climb up, and it's a big 4x4, and it's always very difficult. And, as women, do you wear trousers? Do you wear a skirt or a dress? And I was so short, even though I look tall, but I'm actually only 5'3". And so they had a stool for me to stand on to get into the vehicle. I sort of feel like I need the stool. Thank you so much, Kathy, for that really wonderful and kind introduction. I joke because the name Susan Page is very well known, especially to NPR. Susan Page is a journalist that I often get confused for. And on some trips that I've been on, I went to Zimbabwe when I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and the Zimbabwe press had put out this article that Assistant Secretary of State Johnny Carson would be coming to visit, and they had the photograph of Johnny Carson, the white comedian. Ambassador Johnny Carson is a black man. And later that same year, Susan Page, Deputy Assistant Secretary, is going to come visit, and they had the photo of the white journalist Susan Page. So, and then my whole career at the State Department, there was another Susan Page, and our mail would constantly get confused. So here I am in South Sudan, and I receive her retirement papers. And she had been an NEA, a Near Eastern Affairs hand. So, I'm like, the Near East Affairs Bureau should probably know where she served. So thank you so much to the World Affairs Council of Central Illinois. Wacky. I think I'm the perfect guest to be a wacky person. Thank you so much, Kathy, for inviting me, and for our mutual friend, Mike McClellan, for suggesting me. It's always a pleasure to come back to my home state and the land of Lincoln. I grew up, as the old people would say, just down the road a ways. I grew up in Flossmoor, Illinois, so I attended, from baby age, from 10 months old until basically I left for college. So I love coming back, and I really have not spent much time in Springfield, and so I'm looking forward to the next time I can come back and do all the proper tours and see, especially now that I'm at an institution and in a different kind of role than as a student, where I've gone to presidential libraries. So it would be really wonderful to come back and do that. So I'm going to start off by talking about something maybe a little bit odd that you will think, but I want to put a little bit of context into the conversation. So as you all know, the UN General Assembly meetings just started really yesterday, but that's when all of the world leaders come together and gather in New York for the annual meeting or the annual summit of world leaders and discuss at this big multilateral event what's happening in the world, different problems, and maybe try to come to some sort of agreement. And there are lots of side events that occur. So this year, President Biden, as in most years, led the U.S. delegation. He spoke today, actually, at the UN General Assembly. But importantly, a number of foreign leaders this year have decided to skip the UN General Assembly meeting. In particular, the leaders of China, France, India, and you guessed it, Russia, decided all to give it a miss. So Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, will stand in for President Putin to represent Russia. 19 months into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, many countries in the global south are tired of their issues being constantly placed on the back burner by the world's big powers and key global alliances. So it's going to be hard to see any real reforms of the post-war multilateral institutions created largely by the West occurring around this year's UN summit. But the absence of so many key leaders, in my view, is really telling. And it says something about where maybe the world leaders, or at least some of them, see what is happening in the multipolar world. Is it, in fact, really still worth doing the kind of multilateralism that we used to see and think of, especially with the polarization in the UN Security Council? But the leaders of 3 of the 5 BRICS countries, that's China, India, and Russia, those 3 are countries of BRICS, which includes Brazil, India, China, Russia, and South Africa. At the BRICS' recently concluded annual meeting, the BRICS countries decided to admit 6 new members out of 40 nations that applied to join for membership. The newly admitted 6 states are Ethiopia, Egypt, Iran, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Now, if we think about some of the roles that these countries are playing very, very recently in different parts of the world, including in Africa, this to me is really quite significant. So just to give you some statistics on BRICS, so when BRICS was kind of just an idea formulating in the minds as sort of a complaint group back in 2006, with the addition of South Africa in 2010, the reason for them joining was essentially an unhappiness over kind of the West sort of hegemony over all of the institutions of the global world order. It included a resentment of institutions like the G7, the Group of 7, which is an informal club of, depending on how you like to see it, the West's leading economies, with the US dollar serving as the world's reserve currency, and what they saw as America's hegemonistic global role. So their meetings at the beginning were kind of just a gripe fest. And it was hard to see that maybe in time there would be any real significance to this group. But starting out, the BRICS represented a mere 8% of the world's economy versus 65% for the G7. Now, today, it's BRICS representing 36% and the G7 at 43%. That's a really significant difference. And the group now holds 42% of global population, including 2 of the most populous countries, India and China. The group has also created 2 international financial institutions, serving as mini versions of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, to help member states swap hard currency in case of need, and for member states to fund projects. But the most eye-opening development, I think, was when they admitted these 6 new countries. And these countries are not necessarily all aligned. They have different types of governing mechanisms. Some are rogue states, some are dictatorships, some are absolute monarchies, authoritarian regimes, and some democracies, although one could question whether or not some of them are really, well, they're going in not necessarily democratic direction. But we can say the same thing about the United States, too. So we all have our challenges. And of course, some of these member states, these new member states, have rivalries with each other, including, for instance, China and India, Egypt and Ethiopia. And even their economic policies are really quite different. However, there are some important commonalities. And the fact is that the group now represents some of the world's major oil producers: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, and Russia, and consumers like India and China. And the 4 key Middle Eastern nations where China seeks to increase its influence, which is also increasing in Africa. So this is somewhat of an interesting development, maybe worrying, maybe not. But I think we would be wise to not only be concerned about Russia's influence and China's influence, but the growing influence of some of these other regional bodies that are perhaps under the radar doing a lot of things, especially when we look at the influence of a number of Middle Eastern countries in Africa that we don't talk about very often. And while we ignore them, they are doing a lot of things in the region. So let me just start by talking a little bit now about why Russia even cares about Africa. Besides the fact that they do have lots and lots of natural resources, but of course that's the reason other countries are involved in Africa too. So after World War II, the US faced a dilemma about how to interact with these countries that were technically not yet countries, even though they had a long existence long before they were colonized, but they were still under colonial rule. So on the one hand, the US was allied with European interests, some could say allied with European imperialists in the region, but the US also feared losing influence in post-colonial African states to its Cold War rival, the Soviet Union at the time. But for many Africans, they saw the Soviets as having stood up for their rights to self-determination, their rights to independence. And also, they were much more allied with the Soviet thinking in a sort of Marxist-Leninist ideological view. In other words, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist. While many of the European nations were really quite against the decolonization and didn't believe that African states or African non-states, their peoples, were actually worthy of self-determination. I know that we don't teach very much history anymore, and we seem to be making it even harder to learn our own history. So, of course, we don't know much about other people's history. But it's important that we remember the creation of the United Nations trusteeship system. It was designed so that to prepare these colonies to become sufficiently capable, this is the language, of governing themselves without their colonial masters' guidance. But we don't remember that history, and that's to our disadvantage, because those feelings of condescension and dismissal of their worth, despite African ingenuity, the fact that all of these African nations, many of these African non-nations at the time, but eventually nations, basically made Europe what it is today, and North America and other parts of the world so rich with industrialization. So Moscow, moving forward, not only supported Africans' desire for freedom and independence, but they also sent money. They recruited students from all over Africa to study in the Soviet Union. They provided weapons, and they trained liberation fighters and provided other forms of assistance. That's, of course, exactly what countries do when you are doing diplomacy around the world. It's not just about assistance, it's about forming relations. So even though the Soviet Union had its own contradictions, including its own imperialism in Eurasia, nonetheless, there weren't that many choices available. And the West wasn't quite sure which direction it was going, and including the fact that even though eventually the US started providing lots of assistance, the Kennedy administration was very keen to have really good ties with African states and had good relations with African leaders. Of course, that was cut short, and there were other global interventions that came into play. But also, Africans didn't forget how long it took the United States to stop supporting the apartheid regime of South Africa. So that's just sort of a little bit of a history of the relations and why, when we look today at some of the African leaders saying, why are you pushing us to publicly state that we are in favor of Ukraine or that we are against Russia? They're not naive. They understand that they would like to be able to live in the multipolar world that exists today without having to determine one side or the other, because they can have advantages from different forms and different systems. So let me fast forward a little bit to why Russia is still in Africa, although everyone is still in Africa. But the Russian system is a bit of an amalgamation of competing institutions and individuals who frame their projects as being within the interests of the state, within the interests of the Kremlin. So Wagner Group is a private military company, or a PMC. It actually began during the war in Ukraine, not the current war in Ukraine. So in 2014, the seizure and annexation of Crimea was actually directed from the Kremlin, but the initial phase of the war in the Donbass was not. According to a number of reports, there were hawkish elements within the Russian government who worked successfully to draw the Kremlin further into the conflict. And once in, the Kremlin could not appear to be weak on its main talking point, protecting Russian minorities outside of Russia's borders. So the Wagner Group came to be extremely important, but it is not only active in Ukraine, it's active in a number of different countries in Africa, including in the Central African Republic, where it has the biggest group. But I guess part of the question would be, what are these private military corporations, and what do they do? So if we think a little bit about some of the ones that have existed, Wagner Group is not new. It's just the latest one and the one that we're talking about the most currently. But if we think about some of the other private military companies, think about Executive Outcomes from South Africa. Remember them? Or Blackwater, US. Or DynCorp. We can think of a number of ones that some of us may have even worked for or been supported by in actions that we were doing, not necessarily nefarious, but as private military companies became more and more prominent in some ways, ministries of defense kind of contracting out some of the work to private military contractors or companies, they, like the Wagner Group, became more and more important. Now, there's one distinction that I would make with Wagner Group. They act in a lot of different ways in the different countries, and they are able to go back and forth and mold themselves into what's needed. And that's the primary difference, I would say, between some of the other PMCs that have existed, where they usually have not gotten involved directly in military actions. They've been trainers, they've provided logistical support, sometimes weapons, but by and large, that they have not stepped into that role. It's not across the board, but that's been one of the distinctions. But one of the areas that the way that Prigozhin was able to kind of go around was that he was able to use his skills and to prove to be useful enough to the Kremlin that he was allowed to get some of these individual private contracts with individual African states. generally speaking, the PMCs do not have that authority to be negotiating directly with African leaders or African nations for access to minerals, access to mines, and things like that. But in many cases, that's what Prigozhin was able to do. So some of the other places that the Wagner Group has been operating, and despite his death, will almost certainly continue to operate, is in the Central African Republic. That will almost certainly continue. Libya, where they have been supporting, depending on how you look at it, one of the other leaders who is not aligned with the Western-backed government. He has been supporting, Wagner Group has been supporting Haftar. They are in Sudan. They have been working in Sudan with not only the army, but also with the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces. And now you have a full-blown war going on in Sudan between the Rapid Support Forces and the leader and or the National Army. So this has made it very difficult because in addition to the Wagner Group having private contracts for gold in particular with the Sudanese through the RSF, they also have deals partly with the Russian state to create a base in Sudan, at Port Sudan, which would be another really vital link. But the Wagner Group also has ties to Saudi Arabia and to the United Arab Emirates. So all of these countries are getting benefits from these different deals, and it's difficult to start untangling some of those roles. And that's why I believe that despite the reason that I think the Wagner Group, which I do believe will continue, Sudan has really caused them some conflicts about how they're going to operate going forward, because Egypt supports Burhan, the head of the army, and if you want to say the head of the Sovereign Council, however legitimate or illegitimate that is today. And so they don't want to be wrong-footed. It's very delicate. But at the same time, the RSF wants to continue making money, and who gets the gold that, although Prigozhin or parts of his close allies might get some of that, you can almost certainly know that so is the UAE. Where have recent negotiations for Sudan taken place? Saudi Arabia, Jeddah. They're also allied with, not necessarily directly with Prigozhin or the Wagner Group, but in Sudan, because all of that is connected and everyone is trying to figure out what side they should be supporting without getting caught. So until the Wagner Group, even without Prigozhin, the rest of them who have maybe rehatted, they're trying to decide, who do we think is most likely to win this war? And that's the side we want to be in. So it's complicated. Again, the Wagner Group doesn't really have a permanent structure. They morph and they adapt. In some places, like the Central African Republic, they were able to negotiate directly with the then government and do a peace deal. It ultimately unraveled, but that allowed the government of Russia to actually provide them weapons and to support the peace process and this peace agreement that gave the Wagner Group a whole new stand, because even though the deal has more or less unraveled, the US and the EU and lots of other countries are still supporting the basic principles of the peace deal that doesn't hold. So their presence in Africa is part of a larger strategy that Russia uses when, in part, it needs to have plausible deniability, but in other cases, it's happy to let the Wagner Group and therefore the Kremlin get respect for this peace deal, or having helped to mediate. So think about Iran right now, and who negotiated the deal for freeing the 5 Americans and the trade, the swap with Iranian prisoners, as well as the money that had been frozen. Qatar. Qatar is actively engaged in Africa, and they are also sponsors of different peace deals, peace arrangements. So there's a whole panoply of actors that are there that even the United States, in partnering with Saudi Arabia, for instance, where are they active? What are they doing in these different countries? And we've allied ourselves with them despite our statements on human rights and killings and non-democratic practices, but they're okay for holding talks with Sudanese. So we are also somewhat complicit in all of these arrangements, and we've also had our own PMCs that are active in these regions. So just to conclude before I take questions, the Wagner Group is also active in Libya, which I already mentioned, in Syria, and the Ukraine. And now with the Wagner Group sort of having the blessing of Belarus, Belarus is going to reap some of the benefits of the positive parts of their actions that will benefit to them. So I hope I've shed a little tiny bit of light on how complicated this is, but remind us of the importance, again, of who is now in BRICS, whether or not that might make a difference in this changing world order or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was very illuminating. We'll take questions, and I'm going to take prerogative and ask the first question. Can you talk about who does the Wagner Group actually report to in Russia, and has that changed with the recent plane crash?
So, again, I think this is the part that has changed, and it appears that Prigozhin, when he was sort of being pushed out, he was not able to secure meetings any longer with Putin. And so he basically, insisted, I must have a meeting, by calling out some of the Ministry of Defense officials leading the war in Ukraine. And that's ultimately what got him ousted, not necessarily the plane crash itself, but those military leaders stayed in their positions, and he didn't. And then what happened. So I think it depends on the different times when the Ministry of Defense can be more engaged. Then they don't necessarily want the Wagner Group in such an active way. And so I would say one thing, for instance, Wagner Group had recruited a number of prisoners. But the Kremlin did not really want all of those prisoners. Now that Prigozhin is no longer there, they want to have control over who is going to the front lines. And they can do that with, in the best interest, needs of security, et cetera. So it seems to me that the Kremlin is trying desperately to regain control of what essentially started as, we want this to be under us, but then it's taken on its own mandate and was able to secure individual deals, but they can't do that everywhere. And I just wanted to say, I did really enjoy the food. And so I thought it was great that the chef made food from so many different African nations, because, unfortunately, most people think of Africa as, a country and not a whole continent of like billions of people, but it's great.
Questions from the floor, Chris?
Just a point of clarification, the BRICS figures that you cited, startling change, was that before or after the addition of the 6?
I think it's after.
Okay.
I did look this up, but the article was written after, the statistics were provided after the...
I was going to say, otherwise it's even more dramatic.
Right, no, yeah.
Who is our private army?
Well...
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, sure. So Harvey asked, who is the U.S.'s private army? So I think we can think of a number of different ones from the past and some of the legislation that has been enacted in order to end some of those private armies. But there are private military companies that get contracts, legitimate contracts from the State Department or DOD, and they do operate in a number of countries. I remember maybe 4 years ago, before the world was kind of aware of how much we were doing in Niger, there were, I think, 3 or 5 U.S. military personnel that were killed in Niger. And people are like, wait, what? We have U.S. military in Niger? What are they doing out in this remote area? We're there. Now, those are legitimate military, but we didn't at that time, we did not want to publish that information. We have a whole huge military base there in Agaden. So not private, but the DynCorps are still there. There are a number of them, but we don't necessarily think of them that way. We think of a Wagner group or executive outcomes, oh my gosh, these are rogue entities, but many states do use them.
So imagine you're a Russian ambassador to a country in which the Wagner group is operating. What would you suppose the relationship between the ambassador, is there any, or are we talking coordination?
My guess would be that coordination would be with the Ministry of Defense, unless it's a very clear, this is what you're doing in this country. But now that Prigozhin is gone, I'm sure there will be some reconfiguration of who will be there, and that will probably make a difference. Not necessarily who the head of the Wagner group is, but who's the head in country, what kind of loyalty and support do they have, what kind of loyalty support does the ambassador have?
Thank you.
Given what we've already seen as a very bumpy transfer between the previous command structure for Wagner to Sergei Shoigu and Gerasimov, do you think that there is a even brief window for the United States, some of our Western partners, to roll back some of that influence, at least in the Sahel, or has that window already closed for us?
I think that, so the question was, with the new leadership taking over in the Sahel of the Wagner Group, do I think that the U.S.'s influence with other partners could change or roll back some of their influence in the region, in the Sahel in particular, or has that door or window closed? I guess I would say that I don't think that the Wagner Group has the kind of influence in some countries that we would like to think. So, for instance, in Niger, where there was a coup at the end of July, we saw Russian flags, these small flags flying, and people made it out to be, oh my gosh, this is all Russian influenced. I mean, it sort of makes it seem as if the Africans have, none of their own, exactly. And they're not waiting for whether it's the Wagner Group, another country, to rescue them from their problems. Niger is a particular case because the French in West Africa have just been so brutal and so bad. The population is they're just fed up. They have not made some determination. I mean, the new leadership has not made some determination. Oh, we want Wagner Group out with the French, bring Wagner in. No. But the West's intervention in the Sahel, not only the French, the US, the EU, has also been awful. And what we do, and what we typically do around the world, is we're against terrorism. We don't know what that is. We're anti an entity that is amorphous. And so what do? We always seek to train the military, train the police. I'm not saying that that's bad, but you train people and then they go back to the exact same malfunctioning organization, the police, the military, etc., that doesn't function. So now you've got well-trained people who just get sucked back into, there's nowhere for them to go. There's nothing for them to really do. And then you have some countries where it's really just helping to support their own country's interests, which, every country does, for their own interests. But, it's pathetic to think that France is getting 40% of Niger's uranium, and yet Niger is one of the poorest countries in the world. There's just, people have just had enough. And to say we want the democratically elected president to be brought back to power, well, were those elections really democratic? And when you see the kind of support for these different regimes, some of them were perhaps democratically elected, but we've also put up with Chad's completely just the son of the leader, however he got killed, now replacing his father, or DR Congo, or Congo Brazzaville, or Mali, or Gabon. Really, we want this, but the guy who overthrew the president in Gabon, he's part of the family. So, yeah, that was a long answer.
Yeah, I had a question about the rule of law, these organizations and the rule of law, because one of the issues we know that Wagner pretty much did whatever they wanted when they were in Ukraine, at least until recently, and they are doing whatever they want in many African countries as well. So is there any attempts to bring these organizations that are semi-sovereign into a rule of law, international law?
Yeah, this is part of the problem, is it's always difficult to get accountability.
Susan, could you repeat that?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, so Wagner Group in many countries, including Ukraine, but now also in a number of African countries, is allowed to do whatever it wants to do, including really, crimes, massive crimes. Is there any attempt to bring in these sovereign countries to the international rule of law? So I guess I would start by saying one of the problems is that there are few options, but these countries don't have their own good track record of their own militaries who are also abusing their populations, harming people under, again, the guise of going after the bad guys. But if we think also about how a number of these countries' governing structures were set up after independence, the militaries were not established the way that the US military or other militaries are established, with civilian rule, with, a real set of standards. That wasn't the purpose. The purpose was really to continue the same operating principles that had existed before, but now they're liberated. So it didn't necessarily serve the population. And these leaders, at the same time, they figured out, well, I want a strong military to protect my power, but I don't want them to become so powerful that they overthrow me. And so that's a bit of the problem that we have as well. And if you don't ever have anyone calling them out, including those powers that help to establish these types of systems, well, there's no real incentive.
Did you have a question, Steve?
Yeah, and this may not have anything to do with the Wagner Group, but I was surprised when you said that Ethiopia and Egypt have both been admitted to BRICS.
Correct. So before you ask your question, he said he was surprised to say that Ethiopia and Egypt were just admitted into BRICS.
You were the ambassador in South Sudan when Ethiopia started damming the Nile River, much to the aggravation of Egypt. Could you talk about the dynamics of that a little bit?
Or when they started filling the Grand Renaissance Dam.
Right.
But
which was just filled last month.
Again, yes. The tensions, anyone dealing with Egypt, I don't care who you are, has to understand the absolute vital importance to them of the Nile River. And any attempt, and many attempts have been made by the countries who signed that 1926 Nile Waters Treaty. They've been trying to renegotiate it forever. And it's just really, really difficult because that's truly Egypt's lifeblood. The other countries would say the same thing, but Egypt's like, but we have this treaty. And other countries are like, yeah, but that was so far, so long ago. And so the tensions have been incredibly high. There are also border disputes between Egypt and Ethiopia, as there are in many countries, including the fact that Egypt has tried very hard to do everything possible to make the Grand Renaissance Dam impossible for it to be completed and then now filled and, made possible. So, and even when Ethiopia went to war internally with the Tigray region, Ethiopia was like, that's not good, but that's how vital they see the Nile. When we were doing the negotiations for Sudan, the only thing that Egypt really cared about was the Nile. If we have another independent nation that will need to have access to the Nile, we're doomed. We we don't want that. So they were very much opposed to self-determination.
We had another question right here, ma'am. Yeah.
This to me looks like a tangled web. Looking ahead, say 20 years, what is it going to look like, and who was in charge, and how did they get that way?
Please.
Can you repeat the question?
Sorry. So she asked, looking at this map, I'm not sure which map you have, but looking at this map of Africa, it looks tangled and confusing. So looking forward 20 years from now, what will it look like? Who will be in charge?
And how do they get that way?
And how do they get that way? So I do think that there are some options. I don't know whether any of them will occur, but one thing that I do believe that the United States should do, and they could do a lot more to have their own policy on the Sahel, in particular West Africa or Francophone West Africa, and break away from this French domination, because it doesn't serve our interests as the United States. And we don't want, or we shouldn't want to then be labeled along with France as just being another colonial power taking and taking. I mean, we've done plenty of that, but we could stop our role in exactly those sorts of things. We had the second African Leaders Summit last December, so almost a year ago. What are we doing? Why are we ignoring different parts of the African Union? When we went into Libya with NATO, that was an opportunity to really be on the right side, but then NATO exceeded its mandate and decided to go forward and actually kill Gaddafi. Well, I'm not going to pretend, oh, he's a great man, and but Africans did see him that way, just like they saw Mugabe. I mean, this is somebody who stood up to the West and to the Western powers and wanted to unite the continent. That's not what the West wants to see. So the African Union has signed and ratified, most states have ratified the Continental Free Trade Agreement, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. That's a fantastic way that they can go forward as a group to have, if you're only able to have your goods enter the United States market duty-free, but only if they are the raw goods, the Africans, they're tired of just exporting raw products. They want the factories on their soil. And every time they ask, it's denied. That's not what the West, generally, because they're benefiting too much. So the raw cotton gets exported and it's made into something, or the diamonds, the gold, the whatever, and then it's enhanced and sold for a massive amount of money. So if the West doesn't keep trying to break them into, we're going to negotiate a free trade agreement with Kenya, we're going to negotiate a free trade agreement with, Nigeria, with whoever, which is in our interests, but not necessarily in the interest of those countries. But will they be able to resist that temptation as well? I don't know. But there are a lot of things that could be done. What are we doing with these relationships with the Middle East? I just read an article this morning, it was a flash across my screen, that the US and Saudi Arabia are discussing a potential defense pact. To me, that's just, it's astonishing. So that's a lot different from President Biden's original foreign policy speech when he first took office. So these are the challenges that I think there has to be some coherence. And if we're going to call out a coup, let's call it out. Let's follow what we do it over here, but not over there. Over here, yes. Over there, we just remain silent. But the legislators could also do things to tighten up some of this legislation, which they have done. But there is a provision in the annual state Foreign Operations and Related Programs Act, the appropriations bill, that makes it to declare a coup, whether it occurs by a military or not. It used to be only military. Now it's broader than that, but it sets no time frame for when the State Department has to declare it as a coup. It similarly doesn't state a timeline when they can decide it's no longer a coup-led government. So these are ways that can be exploited both positively and negatively.
That was a great question. I think we've got time for one more question. We'll take two. Yeah.
Do you think that the Wagner Group is in some way an offshoot of the French Foreign Legion?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I've never thought of that, but
Thing I can't think of until
yeah.
I heard so much about the Wagner Group.
Mm-hmm.
The only other private army that I had ever heard of, having grown up during the Second World War, was the French Foreign Legion, and they were soldiers for hire, which, it was extraordinary to think of then, and that doesn't this, only this is much bigger. It's bigger than the government that it's hired by.
I don't think so, because I think that with the Foreign Legion, the French Foreign Legion, I think that they had an actual cause. One could argue whether it was legitimate or not, but there was a sort of reason, a raison d'etre. But I'm not. It seems.
I don't think they were involved with the particular governments. I think they would go wherever they
Whoever paid them. I don't.
Of course, minute compared to what as you're describing this Wagner Group and who are engaged all over the world.
Yeah, I would only say that they also go where they are called or
hired.
Yeah, but it's not. It's usually not a direct engagement with individual ministries. It's sort of.
No, they were independent.
Maybe we can hold that till after and talk. Chris, do you have a question?
Just another terminology question. In the last answer, you referred 3 or 4 times to the West.
And the Global South.
Well, that's where I was going. That one way of framing this would be to look at it as a global South, North-South issue, right? Particularly when we start looking at BRICS and some of those sorts of things. And so, if you split it North-South, then Russia becomes part of the North, right? And in terms of some of the perceptions that you were talking about in Africa, based on history, but do we need to break away from that East-West terminology and begin thinking more North-South?
I'm not sure that I would want to say that we need to do North-South, but I do think that we need, and there is a lot of talk about changing it from, the Global South, and change it, like who determines that, well, we're the North. Obviously, if you have a map, you look at it this way because you're, where you sit is where you stand, right? The Africa map doesn't look like, this is minuscule compared to the actual size of Africa. But when you look on a globe, it's just, this little tiny continent of no importance. So I think that there needs to be a whole rethink of lots of language, and that the US and other places would do well to get away from these black and white labels. You know, the North is Muslim, the South is Christian, the good guys and the bad guys. The world doesn't work that way. Thank you.